Jorge, do we have any people joining us from other places?
Yes, there is. There's people from all over. There's people. I can see people connected on Web Street here in Wellington, in the Cargill, Auckland, Dunedin, and Hamilton. Yes, there's a lot of people here.
Okay,
Yes.
super. So welcome Hamilton, Dunedin, Auckland, and Web Street. And we may also be joined, I'm told, by colleagues from some Pacific National Societies as well. We'll try to stay tuned on that. So our format together in the next few minutes is that I'll invite my colleague Sir Kenneth, who is the chair of the New Zealand IHL committee, to introduce Peter Maurer, and then I'll start off with a question for the president, and ask him to tell some stories and get us started and thinking about some of the things that he sees in the course of his work. So, and we will have a formal welcome as well from Joe for the event as well.
Kia ora. Kia ora rā koutou nā rangatira o te motu puta noa tū ua tātou whānau te Wananui a Kiwa, te timata hia tā tātou kōrero, nā tuku kōrero, nā mihi kōrero, mai tā tātou rangatira hara mai tawhiti, nō reira tēnā koutou, kia ora wati koutou. Welcome everybody to the continued speeches that are travelling live across New Zealand, and possibly out to the Pacific, to welcome you all to our meeting. Formal welcome under the four powers of the Father, the Mother, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou,
kia ora. Thanks very much. Shall we be seated?
Well, it's a great privilege for me to say a word about Peter Maurer. We were talking before about the fact that we met quite some time ago when Peter, having studied history and law, joined the Swiss Foreign Ministry. He was then in Bern, in Pretoria, and twice in New York. I think the first time we met, maybe the first time in New York, when I remember being in a Western European and others group meeting, where this non-member of the United Nations, Switzerland, was taking a very prominent role in debating some American proposal, which I thought didn't have a lot of sense to it. And I fell out both with my then PR ambassador, who thought it was quite wrong for a serving judge in New Zealand to be participating in this kind of process, and fell out even more with the American in that particular group. But from that first visit to New York, Peter then served as PR in New York when Switzerland had joined the UN. He then went back to Bern, was head of the ministry, and then 4 years ago, I think it is, isn't it? 6 years ago, sorry, took up his current position. And he is, I think, the 15th, if I get that number right, in that position. The first holder of that office back in 1863 being Henri Dunant. The only one I can mention out of those very distinguished people I've met, or three predecessors, was Max Hubert, who was an original member of the Permanent Court of International Justice in The Hague, and he and president of that court, and he turned down the opportunity to have another term in New York to take on the task of being president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, and he held that office through very difficult times from 1928 until near the end of the Second World War, greatly handicapped by the fact that there was no convention protecting civilians in armed conflict. There was supposed to be a convention on that adopted in 1940, but for obvious reasons that diplomatic conference wasn't held. Peter is now in charge of this amazing organisation with its unique role of protecting victims in armed conflict. In his time, or in slightly longer times, the budget has doubled, so have the challenges. And one of them, just thinking of Hubert's challenges and the challenge to the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement back in the Second World War time, one of the things among many that they do is visiting about 1 million detainees a year, and they operate in 80 countries. So it's a huge organisation with really quite a tiny budget, greatly helped, as Peter was saying earlier, by the work of national societies. Well, that's by far enough for me, and so it's now open to Rebecca to ask questions or to bring the issues.
We're so delighted to have you here. I have the pleasure of following Peter Maurer on Twitter, which some of you may be interested in doing as well. It's at PMAURERICRC. And because I follow you on Twitter, I have a little window into your the extensive travels that you've taken, even just in the last few months. I think Syria, Iraq, South Sudan, New York, speaking to the General Assembly, I believe, Yemen, Myanmar, and most recently off the plane last night from Australia. I wonder if you could just reflect a little bit on your recent travels and tell us about some of the people that you've met and some of the challenges that they're facing.
Well, when I look on some of the realities I'm confronted with in traveling, and my colleagues are confronted as they live through the year in conflict situations, it's I can really go back first to some of the issues I have touched upon before. What strikes me is the enormous bandwidth of challenges with which people are confronted. When I look, for instance, at Syria, the most striking thing which surprises you is the level of destruction when you go outside of the areas in which war has not yet or has not been immediately in the lives of people. And so what strikes me always when I come from Beirut to Damascus is how normal Syria looks at first sight. You don't see the sights of warfare when you come into Damascus. And I still remember one of the kind of strange experiences I had, even on last time when I went into Damascus. You come on the highway from the mountains and you have a highway, and in the median you have people planting flowers and cutting the grass, and it looks like a normal situation. And when you go 5 kilometers on the side, you see completely destroyed neighborhoods of Damascus and people living in the basements. You have seen that in May I was in the last days of the Battle of Eastern Ghouta. I was allowed by the Syrian government to go into Eastern Ghouta. For a long time we had tried to negotiate access into Eastern Ghouta. And I think in Eastern Ghouta, what I saw is really what just flabbergasts you in terms of the reality of war and how it affects each and everybody. Nobody is living anymore in anything which is above the ground, because above ground level everything is destroyed. And so you see a population of tens of thousands of people basically living in basements, and having lived in basements for a year, 18 months, 2 years, with no fresh water, with no access to any food, normal markets, and everything is scarce, and people are pale. And the only thing which keeps basically alive, keeps them alive, is really the work of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent and the ICRC having an ability to entertain minimal operations in these circumstances. So it just illustrates one reality of war, which of course I see in many places, but Syria by far is the starkest reality, where you see the urbanization of warfare, the massive destruction, the enormous displacements, the scarcity and the stress of life in the middle of war zones. It's kind of an emblematic situation. I remember 2 years ago when I was driving through Homs, it's outrageous what you see in the level of destruction. You see a city bigger than Wellington, and you walk through the city center, and you see the rests of houses, but it's uninhabitable and not anymore a habitat for people. And so this urban warfare, destruction, displacements, and scarcity of life for those few ones who remained is an important series of images that I have. On the other side of the scale, to put an optimistic note in what I also see, whenever I go to places of war and violence, what surprises me is that people still live there and they have an enormous strength and agility and ability to make their lives in an environment which you just can't believe that they can do anything. But for instance, at the beginning of the year, I was in Central African Republic, and what struck me in the refugee camps and the camps of displaced, internally displaced populations in Central African Republic, that 2 weeks after people have arrived in those camps, they are busy opening shops, trying to generate some activities which allow them to survive. And they manage, and I think what strikes me then is the enormous resilience of populations, even in the worst circumstances in which they find themselves. And this has shaped my thinking with regard to what we should do, probably even more than the destroyed contexts. And since I have seen some of the ability to be resilient, it sharpens somehow my conscience how we have to design our programs and our activities and our support, not just as support to the people, but as a support to their effort to help themselves. And I think that's a little bit different from how sometimes humanitarians have understood their role. The traditional image is still that, in particular in an organization like ICRC, probably less in a national society, but in ICRC, that you have a situation of scarcity and you bring in humanitarian assistance. And this is still important in some places. But I think we are increasingly confronted with situations where there is something where people have been able to be their own first responders. And the Red Cross has to be the supporter of the first responders and not a substitute to the first responders. And this has, for instance, shaped our new strategy that we just have approved, because we have put a chapter on top of this strategy and what we do, which is the chapter putting people at the core of the humanitarian response and putting the needs of people at the core of the humanitarian response. And I think all those visits have sharpened my consciousness that the bandwidth of needs is large, and that we have to become better and more intelligent to read the needs landscape and then to formulate a response according to needs, and not to come with our preconceived ideas on what needs might be and sort of front load humanitarian assistance. And so I think we have to become smarter operators in those landscapes. That's probably one of the recognitions that I have come back from the many trips I have done recently.
Yes, thank you. And one of the amazing things about the International Committee of the Red Cross is that not only are you're there in the streets of Homs, but you're also there meeting with the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and also with the Foreign Minister of Iraq and Syria and so forth. When you go into those kinds of meetings, what kind of objectives do you have in speaking with those kind of figures, political figures?
Well, indeed. I mean, you have just mentioned before that I have been a diplomat. Yes, I have been a diplomat 25 years of my life. And what is the big change now as president of ICRC is really this enormous bandwidth of interlocutors that this organization has, and which comes together in that role as a president of ICRC. And when I compare, I really believe there is no comparison in that sense of the job of president of ICRC, because rarely you find those jobs which allow you to be at the worst places in the world where people are affected by war and violence and whatever, and at the same time to be with those who are responsible for the worst places in the world. And I think that's, in terms of personal experience, very frankly, a difficult experience to make. It's not easy. It's not easy to be in the morning with President so-and-so, and in the afternoon in the basement with pale people who are struggling for their lives because President so-and-so decides to be in power and to wage war in his country. So that's a difficult situation. So when I am trying to navigate this bandwidth, I think the most important thing is really, and that's the reason I go to these field contexts, is to bring a message to political decision makers. I think one of the problems, it's a little bit like climate change, it's the externalization of costs that we see. People who take decisions which have deep consequences of lives and livelihoods of people don't reflect about the costs that their decisions have. And I think one of my responsibilities is to remind them what the cost of conflict is. And the main message I'm bringing is one of reality. I think I need a lot of time with those people to tell them, look, I have been there and this is what I have seen. And most of the time, I must say, those ministers and prime ministers and presidents are listening because I have been at a place and I am an interpreter, a genuine interpreter of the difficulties. And they are interested, and hopefully I can advance their reflection. I mean, the concrete objectives are twofold that I have in those meetings with ministers and presidents. One, it's always about the humanitarian space and gathering their support for being able to do the work that we are doing. If we want to go and have access to prisons in Aden, Taiz, and Sana'a, in other places of the world, we need political support to do that. It doesn't happen, it happens through negotiations with responsible political leaders. And responsible political leaders, they negotiate these things, and the access to a humanitarian space has to be negotiated. And I think through the experience sharing from what is happening on the ground, we can mobilize support for humanitarian space. And I think that's important. When I say that, it is also to remind them what their obligations are. That's the international humanitarian law point of these conversations. And then, as I mentioned before, it is also to describe them what is happening on the ground to encourage them to find political solutions. At the end of the day, we have to recognize that the mandate of the Red Cross is a limited mandate. When you are neutral, impartial, and independent, you are non-political. And then you have also to recognize that you are not part of the political solution, which at the end of the day will end the conflict and create conditions under which all the distressing factors that you are confronted with are not reappearing. And I think this is the big task, to see how can you use your presence in the field and your presence with political leaders in order to bridge the gap between the experience that people have and the necessity to take political decisions. And how can we then also, as humanitarians, bridge the gap between neutral and impartial and independent work, which should eventually prepare the ground for more peaceful societies. And I think one of the big challenges that we have then is to bring people together in humanitarian work. So one of the big challenges in conflict situation is to design programs in a way which allow the different, often divided parts of a society to work together towards a common objective. Having water for the community, having a clinic for the community. Maybe to conclude on that question, I must say one of the most touching experience I had in one of my last visits in Syria was that in one of the suburbs of Damascus, the ICRC was able to put a clinic very close to the front line between the Syrian army and the opposition, the armed opposition. And it was really virtually a street which is not farther than between my seat and the first row seat here. And this was kind of a space which suddenly was able to bridge the front lines. Civilians from the opposition side came to the clinic. Civilians from the government side came to the clinic. We managed to negotiate with the fighters, with the Syrian army and the fighters on the other side, that they would let this space happen. And so you have those small spaces of civility and humanity in the midst of very difficult situations. And one of the big challenges I see, how do we grow those spaces? And how do we create those spaces, and how do we create them in a way that those who come from the one side and those who come from the other side see not in the patient waiting for the doctor their enemies, but how can they learn again to live together? And I think that's the critical issue of any humanitarian work we are doing in divided societies, in conflict-ridden societies. And I think that's what is important in these bridging the gap situations from field to diplomacy.
Thank you. I'd like to invite colleagues who are here to pose some questions. I think maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions in a cluster, and then give notice to our colleagues who are joining us remotely that Jorge will be collecting questions that you write in. I hope that's clear how to do that. Do you want to say how to do that, Jorge?
Yes, I also wrote a message to the audience to type their questions in the question box on the tool. Okay. And I have one question here. If people keep bringing questions, I'll raise my hand.
So we'll return to that in a few moments. But firstly, should we have a few questions from colleagues who are here? I see one there. Any other questions? Another question here. Anybody else? Okay, we'll start with those 2 then. Thank you very much. From the back sector.
Hello, yes. So I'm in New Zealand, been here for about 2 years and a half, originally from Yemen. And my question is about the dialogues you have with other presidents, or not presidents or governments within the local conflict. I acknowledge that the conflict that is happening in Yemen and Syria is something that's rooted in the community, but I also know that, and that's what a lot of people in the Western world might not recognize, is that these conflicts are only sustained by the fuel and the greed of proxy powers. So when you have dialogues with presidents of the US, Russia, Saudi, do you tell them that? And do you remind them of their role in giving these conflicts? Yemen is one of the poorest countries and can never sustain a war for over 6 years. So to know that a war has been happening since 2011, where about 10 million children are starving every day, this is something that's caused by something else. So what do you tell these leaders? Thank you.
Thanks, Saku. And Miriam.
Kia ora. You mentioned the changing environment that we're now working in, the ICRC is working in, and I'm interested in how you're adapting to that new environment. In particular, what sort of innovations or use of maybe technology that the ICRC are considering in this space.
Thank you.
With regard to Yemen, I couldn't agree more. I think one of the recognitions that I have on the Yemeni conflict is probably the emblematic conflict to illustrate that we don't have only the challenge of fragmentations in societies and on the ground, but we have also the challenges of vertical fragmentations. And we see that each and every conflict is at the same time not only happening at local level, at national level, but it's happening at regional level and global level. And I couldn't agree more with you that the Yemeni conflict has been there for decades as a local conflict. And today it has become a global conflict, and it has dramatically increased its complexity. When I compose my travel program and when I see what kind of interactions we need, this is really part of the core of ICRC's humanitarian diplomacy, what you alluded to. In order to have a humanitarian operation in Yemen today, you need to talk first and foremost to Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, Tehran, to a couple of others in the region, to the Russians, to the Americans, to the Brits, to the French, to you name it. It's impossible not to have these conversations because at the end of the day, we feel as ICRC that in the case of Yemen, for instance, that our reality has fundamentally changed. While maybe 20 years or 10 years ago in some of the skirmishes in Yemen, we could still negotiate local agreements, today you can't. Because you know that the local actors operate under instruction and influence of actors beyond Yemen. And so you can't negotiate your access to Taiz, Aden, Sana'a, Hodeidah, or whatever if you don't mobilize support for what you do in Washington, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Tehran, and other places. And I think that's the big complexity with which we are confronted today. I mean, some of the modest, and I agree, modest progresses that we have made have come along because we have this huge diplomatic network and we increase continuously this diplomatic network. But I wanted just to acknowledge what you say, that unfortunately the Yemeni conflict is not anymore a conflict which can be solved amongst Yemenis. It is a conflict which can only be solved if you bring convergent diplomatic views of the presently very divergent diplomatic views on the ground. And to make it even a little bit more complicated, those involved in the Yemeni conflict are not only involved in the Yemeni conflict, they are at the same time involved in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in the Sahel, in Libya, you name it. And therefore, the complicated context in which we are is also that there are trade-offs amongst these diplomatic military powers. If you let me do here, I let you do there. When they see on the ground that things are not moving, they are realigning policies. And And I think that's an important reality with which we are confronted. And maybe the last one, you have seen that ICRC has gone further than in the past in being extremely critical with regard to irresponsible weapons transfers towards irresponsible actors on the ground. I think everybody knows, and New Zealand has been an active participant in the negotiation of the Arms Trade Treaty. And the Arms Trade Treaty has this wonderful provision which says that weapons should not be exported when there is reason to believe that they are used in violations of international humanitarian law. For God's sake, I mean, who can seriously not think that when he delivers weapons to Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, and other places, who is still there to believe that they are used in sync with international humanitarian law? I have no reason to believe that they are used, and I think this is at the very origin of another effort that we have undertaken, that we have said, look, if you are going to export weapons into those conflict regions, at least redouble and triple and quadruple your efforts into reining in your partners on the ground to behave and to respect international humanitarian law. We have launched an initiative which is called the State Support Initiative, which really tries to engage the responsibility of actors who at the end of the day still export and have taken the political decisions to export weapons, but don't do much in order to train in international humanitarian law the parties to the conflict which they support. So we have to be pragmatic. It's a typical one of those delicate issues. As a humanitarian organization, we cannot take a decision of sort of being in principle against weapons exports, because that's a political decision at the end of the day. And so I wanted to describe to you on this concrete question of Yemen, how then the organization tries to the best possible find other pathways, at least to nudge belligerents into behavior according to the law, which is at the end of the day the core of what we are doing. With regard to the second question, indeed, this is a really big preoccupation, and those who may have already seen our new strategy will find the approach that we have taken in recent years, and which is also captures in the new strategy. My strong belief is today that we have an increasing discrepancy between needs of people and our ability to respond to those needs, and this gap is getting bigger and bigger. The second reality is that we won't be able to cope with this discrepancy and with this gap within the existing donor countries which have traditionally supported humanitarian assistance. And so we have basically two avenues. We need to mobilize more money, more donors. We have to go broader and encourage others who have the capacity to pay to support humanitarian organization of the ICRC, the Red Cross, and the Red Crescent. And secondly, we can innovate. We can try to do more with less. We can try to partner. We can try to find innovative solutions. And ICRC has pushed a lot over the last couple of years, partnership with the private sector in order to find innovative solutions for water, sanitation, energy, electricity. And these partnerships are starting to materialize because they find ways of doing things better. I give you an emblematic example with the Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne. We have worked over the last 2 years to find a new prosthesis which gives much more agility to disabled people than our past prosthesis. And this prosthesis now is produced at industrial scale with a startup in Switzerland at very low cost price. So we do have an ability to do better with less through innovation. And I think we have to multiply those efforts and to scale and speed those efforts in order to make a meaningful contribution to cope with this dire reality, which is that the conflicts are moving faster than our ability to respond. And maybe another innovation or pathway towards innovation I wanted to mention is really innovative finance. Because what I do recognize today is that we can't rely only on donor money of the traditional scope that we have relied on in the past, which is basically humanitarian credits of donor countries. And we can't rely only on these ones. And if we look at the landscape of finance, there are a couple of interesting things which speak in favor of innovation. Important investors and bankers have told me that worldwide, 2/3 of all investments is happening at market conditions. But 1/3 of investors are ready to invest for less than market conditions if those who are like us, you, are on the ground, are ready to demonstrate social impact. I think we have people with money who are ready to invest in social impact, even if this is less profitable than investing in market conditions. And I think we have to make a credible case as operators in the humanitarian sector that we are able to deliver impact. This forces us to have the data, the proof of concept ready to demonstrate that we can have impact. And then most likely we will find donors from the private sector who are ready to, either as impact philanthropists without any return on investment, or as impact capitalists to invest into something that we are doing and which is meaningful to them. And so one of the big innovation challenges that we all have in the future is, how can we bring together this link? How can we construct the bridge between money which is dormant and which is looking for impact, for social impact, for positive impact in society, but doesn't know yet about what we are able to deliver, and how can we frame what we are doing in a way that it is becoming an investable good that we can put forward towards those who do have money. That's a complicated conversation. And I have invested a lot of time and energy to listen to investors, to talk to them, to try to explain to them what we are doing. And I'm much more optimistic today that we start to understand what is going on in the head of an investor. And if we manage to maybe bring our data right, our activities right, we can eventually find new money for new activities, and this is the objective of innovation. Our first humanitarian impact bond is an example. It's not perfect, but it is an example where we have been able to raise 27 million Swiss francs with the private sector in order to create humanitarian, to create physical rehabilitation centers in 3 countries. And it is a good example, and I think it's an example to emulate and to see how we can move it forward. I mention this because New Zealand is an industrialized country, is a wealthy country, and I wouldn't exclude that with our experience, with your experience here in New Zealand, we can also find ways in which we can mobilize social impact money from New Zealand in order to scale your and our operations.
Thank you. Now, Jorge, how many questions have come in?
I have one here from Hamilton.
Okay.
And I'm just
what
gonna
I would
read it.
propose, if one moment, if you would, what I propose is we have one question from our colleagues who are joining us remotely, and then if we may, if there's any colleagues here who are with the National IHL Committee who would like to pose one question, we'll close with those two questions. The question from remote.
Okay, I'm just going to read it out loud. It just says, how much the Syrian Red Crescent is able to keep its neutrality?
Okay, so how much is Syrian Arab Red Crescent able to keep its neutrality? And then any colleagues here from from the National IHL Committee or from other Red Cross members who would like to pose a question? Yes, 1 second, Ingrid, before we have, let's have a space if there's anyone else. Okay, we'll go ahead then, John, if you're, yes, yeah.
I was just sort of wondering, I'm Gary, I work at the Service Centre in Wellington for the Red Cross. I was wondering what sort of projects would you think would fit the criteria you're talking about in the previous, just with your literature. You understand?
And then we'll draw to a close. Sorry to miss you, Inga, but we'll try to come back. May I just say that any colleagues who are joining us remotely who are thinking of questions, hold that thought for a quarter of an hour and join us on Facebook Live at 2 o'clock. So all you need to do is go to New Zealand Red Cross Facebook page and you can pose other questions that might be forming as well. So thank you very much. Over to you.
Maybe on the independence and neutrality of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent is, of course, the million-dollar question for any national society involved in war. And I have always to remind ourselves as parts of the movement that at the origin of the creation of the ICRC was the deep conviction of the founding fathers that in times of war, national societies would have difficulties to remain neutral, impartial, and independent. And I think that foresight of the founding fathers has unfortunately been proven right. It is very difficult when you are a subsidiary of a government which is at war to remain neutral, impartial, and independent. It's intrinsically difficult and problematic. Having said that, because of the presence of ICRC, I think, in Syria, and because of our engagement with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, I would dare say today, has managed also, because of this partnership with us, has managed to be much stronger in its neutrality, impartiality, and independence than if we were not there. And I think much of our effort in Syria has really been to be a reinsurance for the national society and to cover those areas where the national societies would have difficulties and would run into difficulty with its own government. And our presence is very much, I think, appreciated also by the Syrian Arab Red Crescent because they do know that they are in a proximity to the government, which makes their operations in opposition-controlled territories very difficult. And so I think we have to play intelligently the complementarity of national societies and the ICRC in those situations, not only in those situations in general. I think being a subsidiary of a government comes with advantages. It comes with a disadvantage during armed conflict and violence because governments normally have robust policies against in those situations. And so I think at the present moment, we are reasonably satisfied with the way and the pathway we were able to go with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent over the last couple of years, and which is not perfect, which remains problematic. If they move a little bit too close or too far away from the government, it's a security risk for them. It's not by chance that so many of volunteers and staff members of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent have been killed. They have been killed because, not because they did something wrong, but they have very often been killed because they have been perceived by this or by that community of being too close or too far away from government or from opposition circles. And they have got into difficult situations. And I think the whole idea of ICRC's presence and value added is very much in trying to be a neutral and impartial actor which comes from outside with a more uncontested legitimacy to play to the principles. But I think it's a difficult relationship that we see in many contexts in which we are. When I look at the criteria, your question, what does it need? Look, in order to mobilize private capital, private investment for humanitarian, for social goods, I think it really needs measurability and data. It's something which strikes me when you talk to bankers and investors. They think differently than we do. Basically, investors tell you that anything which is measurable can develop into a financial product. But if it's not measurable, it's not useful for finance. And so investors today are very innovative. And I think the question is more for us. What do we want to measure? What can we measure in order to be an attractive investment? And this is the million-dollar question with which we are struggling. You will see when you read our institutional strategy that we have put almost in all the objectives in the institutional strategy a data measurability objective, because it has a double purpose. I think it is necessary because our traditional donor wants that we give them better ideas on what we do with the money. We can't just have a license to operate and a renewal of finance from countries and from governments if we don't prove what we are doing and what kind of impact we have. So we need to do that work anyway. But it is a dual use, because it has also the use to eventually allow the financial sector then to say, well, that's a worthwhile and measurable objective. The reason, for instance, why ICRC has structured its innovative financing products on visibility centers and water and sanitation is that delivery of water and sanitation can be measured. It's liters and people. It's prostheses and persons treated going back to the labor market. We have to learn to think in those categories. And I think that's the avenue. I know there is a lot of contestation also within the Red Cross movement and within the humanitarian sector. And when I talk like that, sometimes people accuse me, where is the human soul? Where is humanity in your discourse? And I'm very sensitive on that, but we have also to recognize today, we are two things at the same time. We are organizations representing great value and values and ideas. And we have to stand to our ideas and principles and values. This is formative for our identity, and the principle of humanity is not something which is at stake. It's here and we have to stand for it. But at the same time, we are a responsible organization taking money either from the public or from the private sector. And we cannot imagine that we can renew our license to operate if we are not, at the same time as we are value-driven people, economic subjects which deliver impact, results, figures, structures, effectiveness, and efficiency. And it's not cold-blooded economist and a cold-blooded economist which talks to you like that. It's just learning that we are responsible recipients of money. We are not advocating for measurability, for effectiveness, for efficiencies, for lean structures, for less bureaucracy because we don't believe in value. We do it because we think it's the best way to support our value-driven work. And I think that's the big challenge that we have to service those two realities of promoting and standing for our values and at the same time doing it effectively and efficiently.
Thank you. It only remains for me to thank our colleagues who have joined us remotely, to thank you all who have joined us in person, our ICRC colleagues who are traveling with Peter, to thank Sir Kenneth, and most of all, if we might show our appreciation for Peter Maurer's generosity.